Welcome to another episode of the African Literature Association lecture series. My name is Akin Adeshoko. I teach comparative literature and African cinema at Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. And I coordinate this series with my colleagues, Griman Negash, president of the association, and Matt Brown of the University of Wisconsin, Madison. I also like to acknowledge the support of James McCockle with publicity for the lecture. The series is an initiative by the current executive council of the association to engage publicly its members' interest and to generate even more interest among others, and thus to make them join the association. So to those study members of the ALA, thank you for your interest, long-standing interest and continued dedication. And to those who are just getting interested in the association, we hope that your curiosity will be rewarded, and with these lectures, that you in turn reward the association with your interest and join us. Today's event is a joint presentation by two scholars, Professor Lily Saint of Wesleyan University and Bhakti Shringarpure of University of Connecticut. It's titled, "Is African Literature in Crisis?" It's based on research that they both conducted about the teaching of African literature across the world. An earlier version of the outcome was published in August on the online platform, Africa is a Country. And now we have put both researchers in dialogue with two other peer scholars of African literature, Professor Kajetan Iheka of Yale University and Professor Godwin Siundu of the University of Nairobi, both of whom are present today. So we'll introduce the two speakers and then talk about the procedure, and then we'll start. Lily Saint is an associate professor of English at Wesleyan University, where her research explores the nexus between ethics and cultural practice in the global South. Her book, Black Cultural Life in South Africa, Reception, Apartheid, and Ethics, was published in 2018 by the University of Michigan Press. Her recent writings have appeared in Novel, a forum on fiction, the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, the Journal of African Cultural Studies, Africa is a Country, and the Los Angeles Book Review of Books. She teaches classes on global and postcolonial literature and theory, contemporary and canonical African novels, and ethical theory. Bhakti Shringarpure is Associate Professor of English at the University of Connecticut. She's Editor-in-Chief of Warscapes and author of Cold War Assemblages, Decolonization to Digital, from Decolonization to Digital. Her editor works include Literary Sudan, an anthology of literature from Sudan and South Sudan, which came out in 2016. Imagine Africa, a volume from Archipelago Press, 2017, and Mediterranean, Migrant Crosses, Offset Press, 2018. Her co-edited volume, Insurgent Feminism, Women Right War, is forthcoming next year. She was a recipient of Fulbright US Scholar Award for 2019-2020 to teach and conduct research in Kenya, where she is at the moment, Nairobi, that is. The procedure is that the presenters will face the camera first, presenting in whatever form they choose, and the respondents will take turn to offer their comments. Lily and Bhakti will have the opportunity to respond to the comments with additional clarification of questions from the presenters, and then I will step in to introduce questions and comments from the audience. So without further ado, I'll call on Lily Saint and Bhakti Shringarpure to present their scholarship. Thank you.
Hi, I think the way this is going to work is I'm going to speak first, and then Bhakti and I will chat for a bit, and then I will turn things over to Bhakti. So Bhakti, I don't know if you want your camera on or not right now, but okay. So it's our great pleasure to talk to you, and I want to especially thank Akin for inviting us, and Kajetan and Godwin for generously agreeing to respond. I'd also like to thank the ALA, what Bhakti called the mothership, in a recent tweet about this event. It's truly the annual conference that is my favorite, and I can't wait till we're all actually together in person again, assuming I remember to renew my membership. We would also like to thank all of the marvelous participants, especially in the survey. Many of you are probably here, and your generous willingness to share your syllabi with us is the backbone of this survey, and it serves as a reminder of what exemplary collegiality can look like. Okay, so I'll begin by saying a few words about our survey in case there's anyone watching who hasn't seen the piece up on Africa as a country. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about an earlier survey of African literature that was conducted in 1985. And then Bhakti and I will share some of our findings and discuss preliminary ways to interpret and address what we discovered. Then I'll turn it over, as I said, to Bhakti for a few comments on decolonizing the field and some of the institutional challenges. We initially thought to survey our colleagues teaching African literature because we were having a recurring conversation about what people were teaching and how this seemed to differ immensely from what circulated in public as African literature. Alongside this, we were also unhappy with the way that African literature exists in academic settings, particularly in the global north where we both teach, but also in some African contexts. We'll get to that. We wanted to think more deeply about how African literature circulates in institutional settings and how and why curricular models largely marginalize the teaching of African literature. Other recurring dilemmas we wanted to address include debates over what constitutes the canon of African literature and ongoing questions about languages within African literature. So to determine what is being taught as African literature, we asked professors of the discipline to send us syllabi or lists of which works they taught. The survey was conducted in English and sent to academics, a majority of whom are members of the African Literature Association. Over 100 individuals replied, and we're going to share the data with you in a second. And it's obviously subject to various critiques, which we hope to touch on here in our talk and also in the Q&A. It occurred to me after our Africa is a Country talk last month that we engaged in, that when Sean Jacobs asked us to unpack the term African literature, his question unwittingly echoed the one posed at the famous African Writers' Conference in Makerere in 1962. At this gathering, as most of you know, of the luminaries of African literature of the time, in the midst of the continent's epic decolonial moment, participants set about trying to answer the question, what is African literature? That this definitional, we could say ontological question remains at the forefront of discussions of the field suggests an instability in the term itself, which is both an obstacle to the dissemination and teaching of African literature, but perhaps also, as I would like to suggest in a minute, an advantage. But first, some of the challenges. You're probably all too familiar with how marginal African literature is within the academic mainstream. One recent instance of how this occurs shows up in a pamphlet put together by the Stanford Literary Lab, which has been busy for some time now, counting and cataloging literature as a system, mining big data sets to draw conclusions about literature and canon formation. In a project aimed at producing a list of, and this is a quote from the pamphlet, the most reasonable, interesting, and useful subset of the whole of the 20th century novelistic canon, Achebe's Things Fall Apart is the sole African title to score high on the list. Worse, this inclusion of Achebe's novel occurred only because the authors of the study surveyed members of the Post-Colonial Studies Association in the UK in an attempt to counteract the biases of the Eurocentric corpora that we're working from. But because only 23 members of that organization replied, and because the authors compiling the list didn't ask any other academics working in post-colonial studies about their canonical 20th century texts, only Achebe was included in the list. If you think about it for a second, asking post-colonial literature scholars for a list of their canonical books is already going to marginalize African literature, because the category of the post-colonial is so wide in its compass. At one historical juncture, 2/3 of the world was a colony. So as this example confirms, despite their better angels, mainstream academia continues to include non-Western texts as afterthoughts and addenda to a core Euro-American canon. Job openings are, of course, another metric for assessing African literature's marginalization in the academy. and curricular designs in departments and universities as well, which we discuss, some of which we discuss in our Africa as a Country article, the curriculum. Putting aside these considerable obstacles to exposing students and colleagues to African literature, we wanted first to get a better picture of what does get taught as African literature. Our quantitative research is only the second survey we know of. The late Tejumola Olaniyan graciously alerted us to a previous study conducted in 1985 by Sandra Barkan, now Professor Emeritus in the Department of Comparative Literature and Cinema at the University of Iowa. Her survey also seeks to define African literature, though she begins by historicizing previous efforts to do so. As she explains it, the first attempts to define African literature emerged in an academic setting and in ones that sought to categorize written creative works coming from the continent. The earliest works from the continent were typically categorized by these academics as belonging to either Western or African traditions, decisions which were made usually in response to a work's form and content. In this way, written works by African authors were often deemed to belong to the category of Western literature by dint of their use of so-called Western literary genres and/or topics. In the early days of defining African literature, many African writers were categorized as writing Western literature. In this history that Barkan traces, the Negritude movement recentered African literature within Africa, but its essentializing emphases on race and on Blackness particularly was subsequently challenged by scholars and writers for whom the concept of the nation appeared a more useful way to organize and discuss African literatures. Such positions that sought to replace the category of African literature with a more pluralistic set of national literatures have drawn fire themselves, of course, from critics and writers who value the importance of literature's universalist possibilities, or from those seeking alternate structures for categorizing works in the field, opposing both the arbitrary and colonial inheritance of African national borders, as well as the concept of the nation itself as an organizing tool. While some of the debates Barkan recalls have lost traction, others remain disturbingly familiar, so much so that even 35 years after her survey, problems of definition remain largely unresolved. Scholars still wonder if the content of African literature needs to be anchored in experiences which originated in Africa, or whether it is the writer, not the subject matter, that determines a work's African identity. Barkan's questionnaire went out to members of the ALA, just like ours did, asking, quote, for criteria they use in defining African literature, end quote. The responses revealed a complex yet anxious understanding of what constitutes African literature, in which, this is Barkan, the parameters of the discussion were the nature of the linkage between oral and contemporary written literature, geography, race, content, and language. While the majority of respondents feel, she writes, that geography is more important than race, only 14% of those polled thought that it was necessary to include the African diaspora in their conception of African literature. This marks a significant sea change since our own survey's results include a large number of works written by authors currently living and occasionally also born in the African diaspora. Today, however, as our survey's results confirm, the term African literature has a more generous purview. As we understand it, African literature includes works that are produced in the continent or those which show meaningful engagement with the continent, even if the author might reside elsewhere or claim a so-called hyphenated identity. The digital is also a new space where African literature has begun to thrive. And so while we follow in Barkan's footsteps, we explored a different set of questions. Instead of asking respondents to define African literature, we asked them to send us syllabi or lists of works taught in order to get a picture of how African literature is conceived of by those who study and teach in the field. Save for a few exceptions, we considered all the texts listed by instructors as African literature, and we can again talk about the exceptions if you want in the Q&A. So at this point, we're going to switch and move to the survey results. And Bhakti, you can join back into the discussion and we can show some of the data if you're here. I know there's been some technical glitches.
Okay, I'm just going to share screen. Hi, everyone. And this is where our survey was published. The Fabulous African Literature is a Country, very tongue-in-cheek title. And this is our survey. I'm just going to put it in a presentation mode. Okay, Lily, let's start with these. Yeah, let's start with these charts. I think the first one is on genres. If you want to start by talking a bit about it.
Yeah, so as you might expect, novels dominated in terms of genre and what was taught, comprising well over a half of what is taught as African literature. And then I don't know if you have the next slide, but
yeah, and then I think we didn't put the one about gender, but I think the gender breakdown was pretty good. 2/3 of the works were by men. Maybe that's not good, but you know, it wasn't like majority of them were written by male authors. There were significant amounts of women. One author who identifies as non-binary. And then here's the next one. This is the country breakdown, and this is where all the problems start to pop up. South Africa and Nigeria way in the lead. And then Kenya, of course, very high in the lead as well. But one of the things about Kenya is that the amount of authors are actually lesser, right? Am I right? Singular authors in Kenya are lesser. It seems more that Ngugi wa Thiong'o's many works tend to dominate. So it's you know, there's some kind of complications there. And I just wanted to quickly add that people have been surprised about Ghana showing up so much later. I think part of the thing is that there's Ghanaian authors have ended up in the hyphenated identity category. So at the end of the day, you know, there are lesser than one would expect, but there were quite a few Ghanaian authors.
Yeah, I mean, the most egregious thing is obviously the degree to which South Africa and Nigeria dominate in our study, and the absence of some countries from the continent. So 45 of the 54 countries on the continent were represented in our survey. So some countries are entirely absent, and some of them are only represented by one single text.
Right. And the English language bias also shows up here, which is, of course, an issue because many of our participants were Anglophone, which is why a lot of the Francophone countries, which have such rich traditions, like Cameroon, for example, are not quite as up there as one would expect.
Well, why don't you show the languages? That's the next slide.
Oh, yeah, here, yeah. Languages.
Yeah. There were 18 languages assigned. And we should recall, of course, that there's over 2,000 different languages on the continent. So the linguistic diversity that might be possible is far from achieved.
Yeah.
And English and French obviously are the source languages of most of the text, though a few other African languages taught in translation are represented.
Right. And also, you know, a good commentary on that is provided by Babakar Boris Diop in the Africa as a Country roundtable, where he returns us back to the Ngugi language debates, which he has kind of created new iterations for that. Okay, so let's go to the authors and novels breakdown. This is the more fun part in a way. Highest amount of mentions.
Ngugi. Yeah,
Ngugi leads the pack. And a shout out for Adichie, who's of course been in the news for some problematic stuff yet again. But here she is representing. And then the great thing is, of course, Sitsi Dangaremba, Aidu Bulawayo, a lot of women writers dominating this list, which is very nice. All right.
I think that's one more slide. Yeah, a couple more slides. One more. This is the breakdown of the novels. Again, we see things fall apart as the most frequently assigned novel. But as we discussed in our piece on Africa as a Country, Dangaremba's Nervous Conditions and Bulawayo's We Need New Names, interestingly, occupy the second and third spot, which is fabulous. That, you know, that we get these two Zimbabwean women so high up on college syllabi and suggests perhaps that some things have shifted since Barkhan's study. But it also reminds us how singular works are often instrumentalized to represent not only an author's entire body of work, but often her country or even the continent. So in the case of Dangaremga, who now has completed a full trilogy, we note that the second and third books, the third of which was nominated for the Booker, that sadly did not win it yesterday, is not taught, and the second one, the Book of Not, is also not taught to the degree with which nervous conditions is. Okay.
Oh yeah, we just wanted to point out that this is an ongoing round table taking place on Africa is a Country, and it's generally called African Literature is a Country. And then Boris Diop already has his piece up, and then Marcia Links-Quayle, who runs the prolific Arab Lit website for the past many years, has a very critical essay on ways in which Northern African writers and authors are treated in their works. So I hope you can check it out over there. All right, I'm going to stop sharing screen, Lily, and I'll come back to say my book. All right.
Okay, so I'm just going to say a few more things and then turn it over to Bhakti. So, the degree to which canonical works tend to dominate the field, coupled with the near or total non-representation of many important literary traditions, including, for instance, Namibia and Madagascar, to name two countries with rich literary histories that no one mentioned in our survey. The dominance of Anglophone works, the skewed representation country to country, and the generic domination of the novel led us to conclude that the teaching of Africa, while often deployed in efforts to decolonize Western curricula, is in a state of crisis. However, this is not a crisis without the potential for transformation. For while literary works from South Africa and Nigeria often serve to tokenistically include African literature in pedagogical efforts to diversify syllabi and include the continent, scholars and teachers of African literature also teach a dizzying number of other works alongside the predictable ones. Survey responses show that an incredible 405 authors and 671 unique works are being assigned and taught. And with the additions of selections from anthologies that we have left out from this, represent from our data here, the number is considerably higher. So here we see that the interpretive breadth offered by the term African literature also permits for it to represent the heterogeneity of literature on the continent, the recognition of which remains essential in spaces of the global north, which continue to represent African experience with an unforgivable catalog of reductive racist stereotypes. It is impossible not to revel in the range and compass of works being taught. If Africanist scholars were permitted more leeway and given more curricular space, students' exposure to Anglophone and Francophone works and works in translation from the continent could deepen and increase exponentially. Furthermore, giving students access to this wider range of faculty expertise would disrupt the over-reliance on a handful of representative canonical writers who are themselves often opposed to having their work deployed in this way. The sheer number of discrete literary texts being assigned illustrates the vitality and diversity of the field, and also attests to teachers' pedagogical commitment to disregarding curricular attempts to homogenize the continent. It is heartening to note that the survey's results show how committed instructors are to experimenting with decentered, non-canonical, and potentially decolonial frameworks by assigning texts that cover a wide range of histories, genres, and literary traditions. Syllabi show that these professors use creative ways to subvert the monolith that is African literature as we know it. And in fact, pedagogy within such constraints appears innovative, accommodating, and flexible all the same. So this survey is a first step in assessing the teaching of African literature across the globe, and we are aware of its shortcomings. We recognize the vastness of our field and the inherent limitations of our research methods. We hope the data collected here can be used to generate other digital humanities and/or pedagogical projects. Yet what the results of our survey make clear is that we cannot emphasize enough the importance of institutional support for African literary studies. We want to urge departments to recognize the importance of teaching African literature and to develop strategies for disseminating this rich and complicated set of literary traditions. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over here to Bhakti, who's going to offer some thoughts on current imperatives to decolonize literary studies.
Thanks, Lily. And I know Lily ended on a very optimistic and great note, and I might come off as a bit of a killjoy, but I'll try not to. We need to talk about the decolonizing aspects. So, that's always going to come off as quite critical. So in our article, we spoke about the need to make institutional space for African literature. So I wanted to link it to the more popular calls to decolonize the curriculum, decolonize the syllabi, and so on. And here I will zoom in on the American sphere, which is the one we both work in and sort of know best. For most scholars and students working on various aspects of African studies, the calls and initiatives to decolonize land in somewhat odd ways, given very particular notions of what constitutes diversity and also the decolonized university in the United States framework. Any work of African studies, whether art, literature, history, science, has to contend with histories of colonialism, the constructions of discourses of race, and so on. For this reason, it should be really easy to lead decolonizing efforts for whomever wishes to. But this is not the case. Within these struggles, African literary studies has historically found itself in an odd, isolated position in the fraught and contentious space of multiculturalism in American universities and in American book publishing. Some of these dynamics can be explained if we return to histories of the Cold War in order to understand decolonization as an arrested or a failed phenomena, whether in terms of politics, economics, or culture. So my own research looks at how the Cold War stimulated a boundless trail of violence across the world, and then also made resounding interventions in the realm of culture. I've argued, and many others, that the Cold War is the afterlife of European colonialism and sets out to remake the post-colonial world. And it plunges the partially formed post-colonial world that was still grasping for air into an enduring quicksand of violence. Several African, Asian, Latin American states have been branded as failed, and along the way, decolonization projects where the cultural or political are seen as fallen, ruined, foiled, and failed. While the material and political aspects of this history I speak of are easier to map, how do we think of culture within that, and even more so the place of the university? How can we bring this argument to bear upon African literature and its publication, its teaching, its image, and its dissemination into the world today? So I want to briefly return to what Noam Chomsky referred to as the Cold War University. I think he said that when he was at MIT. And here it's interesting to revisit the scholar to spy pipeline, which was made famous by movies like Matt Damon's Good Shepherd, for example. So in that movie, Matt Damon's character is an English lit major at an Ivy League university. And the premise is somewhat rooted in reality because there were professors of poetry that had been known to be recruited into the Cold War because of their ability to do close readings of literary works. And though we know that, we know very well, in fact, that Cold War powers recruited scientists, political scientists, anthropologists, communication studies people, the role of English department always appears quite surprising. But the English departments in the US were very much shaped by these ideological forces, and in turn, they molded the departmental cultures and curricula that we have inherited today. So one argument made here is that English served the Cold War agenda by divesting literature from politics and retreating the realm of literature into an apolitical pastoral sort of space. So back then, one of the new theory kids on the block was new criticism, which became a sort of companion to the flourishing period of literary modernism. And new criticism was a focused method of literary study that laid out systematic, scientific, deeply formalist and objective methods of close reading. So seeing a text as completely as a self-contained aesthetic object meant that biography, history, and comparative approaches had to be done away with. So it's been argued that new criticism suited the Cold War mood, which was spectacle, paranoid, anxious, and ideologically polarizing. English studies and English departments found in new criticism a soothing, calm objectivity. And new criticism eventually transformed just simply into close reading. New criticism was very specific, but close reading was, it became a kind of generalized way of thinking about any literature and the general way in which we teach most texts now in our departments. So English departments aided the imperial project by succeeding in creating a gap or an incompatibility between literature and politics. But with the coming of the Vietnam War and the outrage and the protests against the war, as well as the protests for civil rights and feminism and so on, US English departments were forced into a rupture, into a reckoning of sorts. The push for feminist African-American, Asian, post-colonial literary studies meant that a radical curricular shift was being called for. So even though English and Lit departments became a space where curricular debate began to thrive, the Cold War University at the same time had spent about 2 decades carving up disciplines into complicated and visually problematic silos. So if there's one Cold War legacy that we're still grappling with today, it's that of area studies. So area studies now are considered some of the most interdisciplinary and radical, interesting fields, and they have completely shaken off their Cold War past because they're so progressive. But it did alter for the worse the genealogy of post-colonial literary studies, which in most places is the home of African literature. The African-American, Africana, women's studies, and various Asian and Middle Eastern studies, area studies units were already in place, and they offered a home for many of the radical syllabi restructuring conversations. English departments remained zealously Anglophone and attracted Anglophone scholarship that all belonged to this very large part that we now call post-colonial literature. And for reasons too long and complicated for me to go there, post-colonial literature has been historically dominated by South Asia, followed by Caribbean, and then with African literature and Latin American literature having somehow a less prominent presence. So one of the biggest problems of post-colonial studies, which had a home in English and British Lit departments, was that by its very nature, it could not counter the epistemological, regional linguistic, deeply Eurocentric bias that pervaded literature departments and curricula. Area studies offered a wonderful respite to whomever was left out. The larger point is that area studies programs managed to drive a wedge between what could be a more wholesome and organically interlinked study between various disciplines. Another snag in the wheel for African literary studies was also that American universities had tended to privilege African-American studies with a strong focus on revitalizing and grounding African-American literature and literary histories, which of course makes sense. The Cold War abroad and its linkages with the Civil War at home was the subject of many exciting scholarly interventions. Somehow, attempts to fuse African and African-American studies have not quite worked out. And even now, African literature often takes second place to African-American literature when it comes to pushing decolonized curricula in universities. Recently, an academic at USC, University of Southern California, tweeted that they, and I quote, denied a request for a tenure track line in African history because they did not see it as related to the demands for racial justice, end of quote. Even my own institution is pushing for a cluster hire in anti-racism that is going to end up not centering the African continent. There's also critical Black studies departments that are coming up, and I know there were lots of hires in this field, but the jury is still out on whether these will create more syncretic and fluid futures for the two somewhat disparate fields. Another big dimension we must think about is also publishing. African literature has been emerging and trending for the past 2 decades. And while we don't have time to go into this, I can simply say that Cold War publishing practices have endured. Agents, editors, reviewers remain gatekeepers of what constitutes foreign and international literature. And because of all kinds of massive sets of forces, there is a disavowal of socialist writing. It's considered propaganda, or overly political realist writing. And then there's no real in what is called the introverted novel. I think Eleni Koundouraitis writes about the introverted novel. but in fact, more of an interest in extroverted writers such as Adichie, Yajesi, or Imbolo Mambue, who tend to write for a metropolitan audience that appeals to Western audiences. So we make fun of the US, of course, for its over-the-top use of the term freedom, freedom fries and so on. But brand freedom was a very hard one concept during the Cold War, and succeeded in cultivating writing that was anti-communist, but not crudely so, dissident, but not activist, liberal, but not leftist, stylistically pleasing, but not jarringly experimental. So dissidence and dissident writing was very important to fight against everything going on behind the Iron Curtain, which was associated with totalitarianism, censorship, lack of freedom. So foreign writing, in a way, came to be seen through this lens, and the fetish of the African writer as a dissident writer or an exiled writer continues to this day. So African novels that sell or gain a lot of traction in the US, for example, espouse a very distinctly American liberal ethos. And here we can ask what sort of child soldier novels from Africa become popular, and which are the ones that never are really allowed to enter that sort of public reading space. So why should we academics worry? Well, because mainstream literary culture and academic scholarship have a reciprocal and interdependent relationship. This relationship has proven inextricable, since the circuits between the two contribute significantly what comes to be seen as a classic or canonical or timeless. The circuits of disseminating literature that were put in motion by the Cold War have now become quite logical and a very normalized way of doing things. Agents, editors, reviewers, prize committees, funders, and so on have disproportionate power in determining the importance and success of a book. From an author finding an agent, to then choosing the editor, to then the correct reviewer in the correct tastemaker magazine, the journey eventually also comes full circle, with academic scholarship further bolstering those same books until it's a sort of an echo chamber. In our survey, one of the problems we kept coming up against was the overdependence on certain singular texts to represent one nation, one political struggle, or often the journey of one exceptional individual. We argue that the real problem is with the cramped institutional space being accorded to African literature. But there's also the relationships between mainstream publishing and academia that has gotten even more impetus with the internet. In fact, Boris Babakar Diop's response is particularly damning when it comes to African literature being read in Africa. He says that universities, and I quote him, he says, universities are systematically revalidating the center by teaching the precise African writers who are recognized at the center. And by center, I mean Paris, London, or New York. So in their search for literary legitimacy, African authors writing in French or English often focus on themes that are likely to appeal to Western readers. And this also makes them write a certain way. So this is a very damning, intense kind of statement that we can unpack, hopefully, in the discussion. So this is the backdrop against which African literary studies functions as a field. It has indeed been over 50 years now since Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Taban Loliong, and Henry Awor published their amazing resistant manifesto titled On the Abolition of English Literature, which asked for the end of Eurocentric literary studies. Too few universities have adopted this plan, and every few years we find ourselves in a state of crisis when it comes to strategically decolonizing syllabi, curricula, and the university itself. In our survey, we found that even in African universities, most still followed a traditional, almost Euro-facing curriculum design, and too few have decolonized curricula. University of Nairobi, Makerere, WITS are some of the examples of those, but they're still far too few in number. Strengthening African universities and reversing the circuit of knowledge from there to here in the global north, rather than from the global north to Africa, needs to be a top priority for all of us in the field. And by this, I mean, holding conferences, the texts we teach, where we find those texts, we have to actively work to center the continent in this. So in conclusion, I think it's high time that institutions of higher education carved out more space and funding for the study of marginalized literature and reckoned with the deeply embedded epistemological biases inherent in curricular design. Individual departments must be willing to alter their definition of diversity itself to decolonize diversity. Giving students access to the massive existing body of African literature is only the beginning. We view this survey and our early observations as a provocation. We are only making a very small dent in the massive challenges that lie ahead of us, and we call for the real work to begin soon. So I hope Lily can join me now. And
Yes.
hey.
Hi.
Hi, I think we have some respondents.
Maybe they're sleeping.
We have repeated ourselves. Hey, Kajal.
They are awake. They are
Awake
awake
now. Yeah, let me thank Professor Adeshokon for this invitation to respond to Professor Brown for logistics, with with the technology. I also want to thank, Professor Shringarpure and Professor Saint for undertaking this important study and for their illuminative presentation today. We don't pay much attention to teaching really as such, and it's just in African literature and literary studies more generally. So I'm grateful for this work. This work is indeed timely as calls for diversity crowd out emails and listservs in the United States, and as students from South Africa to Southern Alabama push for curricular changes to make the curriculum less white. But as Lily and Bhakti's study demonstrates, the browning of the English curriculum does not necessarily transform our pedagogical practice. We are teaching the same set of authors and texts, hardly making room for newer authors, except the ones that have entered the so-called canon of world literature. It is striking but not surprising that the commonly taught books on this list are those that have successfully migrated into that corpus that we've come to know as global, Anglophone, or world literature, those ones that travel way beyond the original context. Achebe's realism, Dan Geremba's Bildungsroman, Coetzee's postmodern style. The problem identified in this study persists because global or world literature classes can only take a certain kind of African literary text, and just a few at a time. In my own home department, Yale English, the world literature course was introduced only a few years ago, following students' complaints of the whiteness of the curriculum. Some of you may have seen that my colleague, our own Stephanie Newell, received threatening messages for championing the new course. And the department chair had to publish a piece in the Washington Post about these changes. Do you know what the title is? Don't worry, Yale still teaches Shakespeare. I'm grateful to teach this world lit course, and I'm thankful for the work that colleagues and students have done to make this happen. And the course includes 3 African novels, Ngugi's Grain of Wheat, Dan Geremba's Nervous Conditions, and Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. You will see it aligns with the overall findings of the study that we're looking at today. Bookending the African materials are Robinson Crusoe and History of Mary Prince at the beginning, and Arundhati Roy's A God of Small Things at the end. Where's the room for additional African materials in such a course? Where's the room for experimentation to teach lesser known materials? Now I'm lucky also to be able to teach a first-year seminar in African literature that introduces students to Dino Mengistu's All Our Names, Doreen Begana's short story, Tropical Fish, and Sindewi Mangona's Mother to Mother. However, such a class didn't make in my previous institution, at least not with that title. The closest I came to teaching such a class was in one called Post-Colonial Literature, where I then taught only African materials. Students did express disappointment in the course evaluation, of my trickery, indicating that they expected a broad survey of post-colonial materials, perhaps from Achebe to Rushdie, to Walcott, to Naipaul and Roy, a global Anglophone rendition, not a reading of David Rubadiru's Stanley Mutesa. Who is at fault here? The students, me, the department, the profession? How do we center a robust African literature curriculum if the MLA job list includes a smattering of African literature positions and much more positions in global Anglophone or world literature? or when the African literature person is hired, not necessarily due to what they know about African literature, but to what extent they can cover the non-Western world. They can teach the British Lit Survey. Where do we go from here? Some departments complain that the kind of diverse African literature classes that Lily and Bhakti recommend just won't make, students won't take it. How do we respond to this? Perhaps they need to require students to take such classes. But then what does institutionalizing African literature in this way say about value? Value of the departments, of the students, of the profession? And what does it say about the value of Africa and its knowledge systems? We teach our students that literature is conditioned by social factors and that it shapes the social. But what this survey outlines more forcefully is the social conditioning of the pedagogies of literature. It is gratifying to see iterations of decolonized curriculum on the continent, but it is also the case that universities on the continent, many in Nigeria, for example, still do prioritize Euro-American literature, the colonial library, so to speak. It is tempting to dismiss this tendency as a colonial mentality. Some of it is, but there's a deeper socio-political and economic rationale for this. Literature offers a promise of knowledge and in some cases affiliation with sites of socio-political and economic interests. Permit me to cite an Adichie here a little bit. Readers of Americana will recall Obinze's earlier fascination with American literature. A colonial mentality should have tethered him to Britain, but American cultural products provided a portal to a world he wanted to explore, to be part of in the face of Nigeria's dysfunction. And sometimes the interest is economic, as the steady interest, and I would say dominance in Asian literature and culture suggest. To bring this back to the survey then is to ask why works of Nigeria and South Africa constitute the most commonly thought African texts in Lily and Bhakti's survey. Is this a coincidence, a peculiar literary exceptionality, or does this have something to do with their demographic, geopolitical, and economic standing on the continent? We need to do more, say more about these connections. Finally, as we press departments and institutions to decolonize English studies, there is work for us to do as well. We need to decolonize our prose centricism, this super inclination toward novels that we know, but this study actually confirms. Lily and Bhakti's data confirms that we don't teach African poetry enough, and I'm guilty of this too. And then, but looking now, I will see that drama is actually worse off than than poetry from the numbers up there. I am again reminded of Obinze's fascination with the University of Ibadan in Americana because of Ibadan. That poem by the extraordinary J.P. Clark, who we lost recently. Ibadan, running splash of rust and gold, flung and scattered among 7 hills like bronchial china in the sun. Are we missing the opportunity to connect students to the rich and evocative verses from the continent? The running splash of poetic gold, from Africa. I wonder too if poetry provides us with a strategic tool to stem the anthropologization of African literature by our students and our colleagues. Is poetry the bulwark against the fetishization of content, not a form of content in African literature? Given that poems such as Ibadan forces us to stay with imagery, to work with language. It is time indeed, I'm closing here, to heed the lesson of one Igbo proverb popularized in Chinua Achebe's writing. Egbe bere ugo bere, nke si beye bere kan kukwaya. Let the kite perch and let the eagle perch too. If one says no to the other, let its wing break. The commitment to prose in our pedagogy should not be at the expense of poetry. Our decolonial practice should make room for both and other genres as well. This lesson applies to the critics of curricular change at Yale who worried that Shakespeare was going to disappear from the curriculum with the introduction of African literature. Most recently at Cornell, where the English department was renamed. And at other institutions, who are actually struggling with and, grappling with curricular changes right now. Fans of Shakespeare and Milton need not see the teaching of African literature as a threat to their favorite authors. Our students are better off learning about Shakespeare and Soyinka, Milton and Mugo, Poe and Pabitek, Egbebere, Ugubere. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I pitch in at this point? That is, if it's okay with everyone. Eh? I think that first I should begin by thanking Akin, Bhakti, Lily, and Kajetan for this wonderful opportunity to share ideas about where we stand in terms of literature, its place in the curriculum, and possibly its futures. And of course, I want to also begin by concurring fully with Lily's and Bhakti's observation about the nature of literature and how it has actually been taught, appreciated, and critiqued or delivered to the rest of the world. And of course, given our position, those of us who ply our trade in the global south, given our position, we get quite often trapped in multiple binds. The bind of history, for example, and how history determines what we teach and how we teach. The band of economics, currently in terms of the policies by government, which stipulate priority areas of the academy generally and the university specifically, as well as the band of our own biases in terms of how we were fashioned as academics and how this fashioning determines our appreciation of what we consider worthwhile literature, worthy of teaching, worthy of researching, worthy of publishing about, and so on. And so to sort of give a more intelligent response to the presentations by Lily, Bhakti, and Kajetan, my contribution would begin by focusing on what I consider to be the changing form or nature of the university in Africa in terms of what constitutes the university, but also in terms of what is the expected role in the context of a developing country with ambitions to be middle-level, middle income in a few years. Now, to appreciate sort of the ups and downs of literary production, consumption, and export from a Kenyan perspective, I want to begin by pointing out that the nature of the Kenyan university has changed over the past 50 or so years. What began as a sort of an incubation for human resource tended to focus more on pedagogy and preparation of manpower. And this had a direct impact on how literature was conceptualized and how it was taught. And that's how then at the Pioneer University then, which was University of Nairobi, and to a lesser degree, Kenyatta University, the curriculum, the literature curriculum was limited in scope because our students needed to learn other teaching subjects to be able to serve as teachers in the many primary and secondary schools that were in the country. So it was only much later that the research component of the university became critical. And that also had implications because at the same time as people were discovering the role of the university as a research institution and encouraging people, actually recurring academics to conduct research, the university had fallen prey to the dwindling resources where government was withdrawing support for academics. And therefore, the lives of the academics became more precarious than ever. And this is where I think Bhakti's research on the impact of the Cold War on literature and the university generally comes in, because during the period of the Cold War, when it was really hot in Africa, talking about the period of the 70s and coming to the 80s, the university became, as an institution, a suspect player in the public lives of Kenyans. It attracted greater surveillance from the government, more reactionary agents, if you like, because at that point, the university was no longer just seen as a producer of manpower. It was actually seen as an incubator of subversion of dissidents, and which therefore had to be sort of starved of resources to make sure that it could barely sustain its best brains. It was around that time that Kenya, I believe, and many countries in the third world, the global south, which used to be called the third world some time back, suffered the plight of what we came to know as the brain drain. So the best of our brains exit the country to go to Europe and North America, either as exiles or as people who are simply in search of greener pastures. During this period, then, the nature, in my view, of literature, the nature of the teaching of literature took on a more precautionary tone, so that even those academics who remained in Africa and in Kenya specifically began teaching only that which they considered to be a safe genre of literature, for example, or safe texts of literature. And that explains, if we followed the graphs that Bhakti and Lily gave, that explains, in the Kenyan perspective at least, the preeminence of the novel. And that was partly because as a genre, drama, for example, attracted closer surveillance and closer concerns from the state agents, as opposed to to prose and to poetry. And that explains why, for example, if we look at Ngugi's run-ins with the government, he was punished more for his drama as opposed to his prose fiction. And yet, whatever he was saying in drama, for instance, I will marry when I want, is more or less the same things that he was saying in prose, for instance, Devil on the Cross. So it was a matter of, I would say, subconscious or unconscious self-preservation that led to the focus more on first of all, prose, but secondly, a kind of a return to Eurocentric literature, which was considered to be less harmful to the immediate political dynamics in Kenya. Now, this then brings me to another point of what kind of intellectual or what kind of academic or what kind of literary academic, to be precise, was in charge of teaching what kind of literature. As I've insinuated a while ago, a good number of people who had enviable credentials left the country in search of greener pastures elsewhere. A good number of very impeccable scholars as well chose to remain in the country. But their decision to remain in the country was sort of calibrated by another decision to focus on a self-preservatory literature, which could sort of allow them to survive the onslaught of the government while at the same time remaining meaningful. Those of us who are familiar with the Kenyan scenario, you may have heard about the problem of the Kanu professors, that is, professors who were deliberately planted within the university by the Moi's Kanu regime to sort of push their agenda, which is more or less the same thing that Bhakti was speaking about in reference to Chomsky's own idea of the Cold War university. And some of these were actually people who sort of made critical decisions in terms of what curriculum was taught and how that curriculum was configured. So whereas in the current discourse of decolonizing the university, we are talking about radical forms of knowledge production, radical forms of pedagogy, and so on. The professors that we are talking about who dominated the university in the 80s and 90s, dominated in terms of being in positions of decision making, were more preoccupied with reactionary curriculum that was structuralist in the sense that it celebrated the existing structures of power, structures of authority, and the general logic of law and order. But then there was another strand of this same professor or academic, one that Mahmoud Mamdani has, some people would say, so ungraciously described as intellectuals in the market space. These were those academics who positioned themselves for consultancy services to serve in the civil society and the nation and non-government organizations for some supplementary income and things like those. And then, of course, we also have the third caliber of professor who positioned themselves for either political electoral offices or appointment by government. That is simple politics of cooptation. And I think this was more or less the position in other parts of the continent, because I recall that our friend Paul Adesami, in his collection of essays, Africa is Not a Country, speaks about these different calibers of professors who make deliberate decisions based on the circumstances that frame their lives. And these decisions have a huge impact on how literature is conceived and how literature, of course, is taught within the universities. So what Bhakti and Lily observe as a certain preeminence of certain forms of literature in the African curriculum is partly explained by these dynamics, which of course suggest that once, for instance, I have taught Ngugi's, say, a grain of wheat or things fall apart, I really don't need to labor so much to explore new oceans, because my time is, the demands on my time, are so many. I need to go to consultancy, perhaps I need to go and consult with politicians and things like those. But of course, this only applies to a certain fraction of academics. And there are others who, as Lily and Bhakti also observe correctly, who have become a lot more innovative. They've become a lot more enterprising, pushing beyond the boundaries of the canon and introducing new forms of literature in the curriculum, which unfortunately do not attract the attention of our colleagues across in the global north and in the west of Europe. I think the point then that I'm making is that as Lily and Bhakti correctly point out, the narrative about the nature of literature being taught in Africa today, first of all, is a product of global dynamics, including the global war, the Cold War, but it's also a very complicated narrative that defies simplistic or linear analysis and linear explanations. As I draw towards a close, I just wish to speak about two things. One, which is insinuated or implied in the text and in the presentation, but also one that I think is completely missing in our discourses now, but which has a huge impact on how literature in Africa is understood and taught. Now, I'm talking about, first of all, what some analysts have called the massification of university education in Africa and in Kenya. You see, we've had a huge proliferation of public universities in Kenya, some in urban, others in rural areas, some public, others private enterprises, and so on. And these have not been accompanied by a corresponding growth in human resource in terms of academics who are well grounded in their disciplines. And they have also not been accompanied by expansion in physical and other infrastructures that are required to make the teaching and learning of literature more profitable, more current, and more adequate in terms of challenging the perceptions that dominate other parts of the world. And here I'm responding to Bhakti's concluding remarks when she notes that whatever efforts that we've made so far and achievements towards decolonization, they constitute a very small dent in what is actually a bigger challenge of ensuring that what emerges out of Africa by way of its literature is actually what filters to the rest of the world, and not just a few canonical male-authored texts, of course, allowing for a few female voices. And lastly, there's the issue of the place of oral literature. I mean, every other time we talk about the revolutionary memo that the Ngugi, Owor, Anyumba, and Taban Young wrote some 50 years back, there's always a tendency to focus more on how they sought to recenter or decenter the European canon with some African voices. But a significant way in which this was done was to take a very deliberate decision and have oral literatures as an important component of the curriculum. And over the years, we, for example, at the University of Nairobi, have had a very strong component of oral literature research and publication, which, of course, by its very nature, does not travel as far as the print literature, but which nonetheless has a huge impact on how people encounter their experiences, how they theorize these experiences, and how they are then prepared to interpret literatures from other parts of the world. So I would say, by way of conclusion, that indeed the problems of being post-colonial states like Kenya is that we live and operate in the shadow of big encounters. In this case, we're still living the afterlives of colonialism, which were more, of course, which were more plain. I mean, during the period of the Cold War, and which continue to dictate how much of the literature that we read and how much of it that we produce. Now, the fact that many of us have been reduced to eavesdroppers in our own literature, as Bhakti suggests, that many of our writers now do their craft with the Western audience in mind, is also an indication of just how much work we need to do for us to be able to speak to each other and for us to be able to appreciate what we are doing on our own terms without having to seek validation from elsewhere. Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is quite cool. Less provocative than I was imagining. I expected brickbats to fly, but I didn't see much of that. But as the moderator, perhaps I should be moderate in my view or expectations. So I guess that it is all right to go this way. So I do not, I'm hopeful. I mean, I would really love to know whether Bhakti and Lily have a response to any of these to go with. Before we move towards the general audience. We haven't seen the questions coming in yet, but at the same time, we expect there to be a brief dialogue between the presenters and the respondents. And I thought that we could go that route first and see what's coming through. I do have a couple of questions, but I will defer to you, presenters and respondents, to try to have a dialogue if there are questions arising from these. Okay? So let's see whether we can do that for a few minutes, maybe about 10 minutes, and then we can then open things up. All right?
All right. I had a very quick comment. I absolutely loved Kajetan and Godwin's response, because you took us so much outside of the conversations that we've been, in a way, stuck in, you know. And I think the only thing I wanted to highlight in that, and I'm absolutely grateful, is how seriously you took the question of genre, you know. And, you know, I tend to never teach plays, but I do tend to teach poetry, edit poetry, and so on. So it's interesting, of course, to think about decolonial practice, or to think about diversifying, or whatever, decentering, recentering, but through the lens of genre. And I know, of course, for a fact, while Godwin is, of course, critical of this, I know that the graduate students, the master's students at University of Nairobi do these oral literature modules, and then they take a week and then go off and, you know, will interview somebody and, you know, create their own oral literature and so on. So, and I haven't thought about it a lot, but it was nice of you to bring to attention the importance of diversifying genre.
Yeah, that was precisely what I picked up on across the two responses too. Thank you. I agree with Bhakti that those were phenomenal responses. And, like she said, we've got stuck in our own way of thinking about the data, and you've added a lot to it, to the way that we can think further about it. And I really like, Kachatan, what you were saying about poetry, particularly as getting us away from the focus, the sort of maybe ethnographic focus on content that prose enables, and sort of made me question my own reliance on the novel, and to think about the novel maybe now as like a neo-colonial form, right? Like, what if we taught African literature and just did away with the novel entirely for a while? How would that change what we taught and how we taught it, and the way we discuss literature, and the play, and Godwin, what you were saying about the self-preservative quality of academic work and writing in particular was very interesting to me, because of course drama was more provocative and more dangerous because more people could access it. Right, and the novel requires literacy and access to purchasing novels or borrowing novels and so on, which drama doesn't require. So drama also has these more radical possibilities, I think, that as poetry does in different ways. So I agree with Bhakti about this need to re-question the genre. There were some professors in some of the survey results we got, I won't name them, but I marveled at how much poetry they taught. Some professors really just teach a lot of poetry, and some of that was in the anthology stuff that we didn't bring in. So I think if we were to redo our results, we could bring some of those in, and that might make poetry be more present than it looks in the current situation.
We can name one woman we adore who
Eileen
teaches so much
Julian,
poetry.
yeah.
It's Eileen Julian. Oh my God, entering her data killed everybody.
Yeah, it took a long time. She teaches a lot of different things. It's great. And then the only other thing I had was just a reaction really to that Yale piece in the Washington Post. Don't worry. The worry, like what is that telling us? The anxiety that is produced in academics around the destabilizing of their canonical curriculum is just so profound. And this is part of the challenge that we face, is, it's anxiety that they're becoming superannuated, that they're going to be replaced, that there's no longer going to be a space for them, that their dominance is going to be diminished. But just that was just very shocking to me.
Yeah.
And only last week in my own department, it's been years of debates about major authors, and major author only means Chaucer or Shakespeare, and it almost never means anybody else. I've tried to say, like, let me teach just an Asiya Jabar course or just whatever, but never, it never goes through. So we can kind of balk at Yale, but it's pretty universal situation, not universal, but it's a majority situation. I mean, the two departments I've taught at City University of New York, and which is like one of the most diverse universities in the US, the super traditional English lit curricula in many of the colleges. And same thing with the department I'm in now. It's so hard. And it's about the old guard having the worry and the anxiety that they will become meaningless, Yeah. I don't know how one tackles that at an institutional level, at a colleague level, I don't know how one tackles that.
Yeah, but listening to this, I definitely want to agree that yes, this is not peculiar to a certain kind of institution. It's a universal thing. Which brings me, to I think, the point you were making at the end of your presentation, Bhakti, which ties to Godwin's, fascinating response too, which is really, what happens if we focus not on these universities here in the global north, and if really this conversation is centered on, what is the continent telling us, or what is it teaching us? Because I remember when I first read your piece in Africa is a Country, when you talked about your method, I was struck by the the conclusion basically that, there were basically a few respondents from the continent. I was, so picking on that, and then, what Gordon was saying about, oral literature, for example, and like, how would this shift the conversation, if we were really, if the conversation had, a dominance really, or so much more, respondents from Africa, how does it shift? And does it matter then, what, our institutions are doing and what they're not allowing us to do? I think, that was really something that struck me as I listened to Bhakti conclude, and as I listened to Godwin, how, a kind of African, kind of direction, an African directional survey, but also, response will really shift, what, the conversation we're having.
I mean, when I was saying that, I'm not even saying like, take the funding, like this kind of, we are perceived in the US universities as having all kinds of funding, and we do compared to universities on the continent, and to kind of, produce knowledge in Africa through continents. And Godwin is, of course, part of the Eastern Africa Cultural and Literary Studies Conference, which is incredible and does that kind of work. I'm not even talking about something that huge. I'm really saying, like, let's find texts that are being produced there. Let's look more creatively. This is where I am, concerned about academics' over-reliance on reading those same tastemaker magazines, New York Review of Books, so on and so forth, and getting all the information from there. So it's, in a way, we shouldn't rely on that. We should be looking somewhere else and complicating our own search when we set up our syllabi and so on. So we have questions, I think.
I think just before, if you allow me, before we take the questions, there's something else that I wanted to say with regard to how the university currently, and more precisely the departments of literature, get caught up in debates about the markets and employability, for example. I know for sure that many students in Africa and in Kenya go to university for university education so that they can get or secure employment. Unlike other parts of the world, I want to imagine, where somebody can go to university to study music for the love of it, or literature for the love of it. There seems to be a more functional logic for many of our students who come to university. And that explains two things. One, it explains the dwindling numbers of students. Of course, a factor that is also influenced by the STEM, humanities, debates, and politics, and so on. But it also explains sometimes individual lecturers' own predicament in terms of dealing with students whose priorities in the literature class are completely different from the ideal student that we're talking about. Speaking from my own experience, I have taught undergraduate classes where, for instance, students learn literature alongside sociology, which is more promising in terms of employment possibilities. Students who learn literature and communication, who aspire to work as journalists in the print media or news anchors and things like those. And so you have real struggles with our students when you try to push them towards new horizons of what they can read beyond, of course, the reading list. And then, of course, what that means is that you have situations where what one may call subsistence reading becomes the norm. And that, of course, also explains why it becomes virtually impossible for you to induce sufficient interest in not just students, but I think the whole spectrum of actors in the whole business to become more creative. And I'm talking about this in relation to, for example, the procurement process that the department has to undertake before they can get that new book published by Chimamanda, or that new book published by Nadifa Mohammed, or whatever. And so eventually people get stuck with what is available. Because if you're teaching a first year group of 300 students, a very practical consideration before you come up with the course reading list is, are these books available to each of these students who are living on less than $1 a day, and so on and so forth. So I think the point then is that even as we talk about all these things about literature and whatnot, we also need to pay respect to the existential considerations that the academics and their students have to live with every single day. Yep.
All right, the questions are coming in, and we'll get to them. But I do, as I said, have my own question. There are several, but I don't want to push too many of them. But I think there are some to complement what the two presenters have, or two respondents have brilliantly laid out. I thought I should ask, and partly also because it's only now that some more information becomes available to me, and I just said, okay, I think that's interesting, which is exactly to say that when Lily was presenting, I was a bit taken aback to hear that you really were aware of Sandra Bakan's survey from 1985, but that really wasn't in your Africa as a country. Why did you, what informed that decision to exclude that? That's number one. The other question I have is actually for Bhakti. You, of course, towards the end of your presentation, you brought the idea of what Ngugi and Owo and Tabalulu Young did in 1968, the very famous abolition of the English department. And then, of course, related that to what was going on at the time. But I guess that what puzzled me about that was really to bring that back to the Cold War rather than the present. Okay, so I'm just interested in why was that? What relevance do you think that has towards the discussion that we're having now, and why we're not hearing more about what's going on in other African universities in terms of actually decolonizing the curriculum, so to speak, like IFE, for instance, and other places where people have actually taken the decision to abolish the English department at the same time that Ngugi and others were doing that. So is it a question of your own interest, or is it a question of comparative attention to other spheres? So I thought I'll ask that, those two questions, and then maybe we'll go to the others. Thank you.
I can just quickly respond to your question about the absence of Sandra Barkan's survey in the Africa as a Country piece. There's no real intentional explanation for our exclusion beyond the brevity of the piece that we published and the sort of accessible audience, less academic audience that we understand Africa as a Country to be targeting. So we just, we had to take a bunch of stuff out, and one of them was the history of previous surveys. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We cut the piece from 4,200 words to like 1,800. So, Sandra had to go, unfortunately. But about why I brought up Ngugi, only because I think I was speaking more within the context of some of the things being evoked within US departments and US universities, and Ngugi, not so much for that particular manifesto, but always coming up because of the decolonizing the mind stuff. I think this decolonize that keeps recurring every few years, and that's because as I was saying, I think it's arrested or it's failed or it never happened. So we always return to it, and the person one always refers to is Ngugi. So that was one reason I was mentioning it. In terms of us and African universities, we reached out and we tried to the best we can. We often didn't get back for various reasons enough responses. But we then ended up conducting informal sort of conversations with various academics. So one of them was, of course, Boris Diop. I think he taught at IFE actually, and he, he has very critical views of what's being taught there. Susan Kigoli in Makerere, who says that they did adopt at the end of the day, a very similar model to University of Nairobi, which is a focus on oral literatures, non-Eurocentric in a very deliberate way. I remember speaking to Kajetan, asking him about what he felt was taking place in universities in some universities in Nigeria, and then also spoke to some folks in North Africa about places like in universities in Rabat and so on, which was 100% absolutely French European curricula. So anyway, so, I love that memo. So maybe I just bring it up because I like it, but Gugi haunts us. Gugi and his Decolonizing the Mind, the book, and then for department and curricula, that particular memo haunts us. And I used it more within a US context at the end of the day.
Okay, well, thank you. So the questions, there are two, and I'll just put them. I think they are mostly addressed to both of you, that is to Bhakti and Lily, although making references to the respondents too. So it's actually very helpful that they too may have a way of pitching in. The first is from somebody who actually was one of your respondents who responded to your survey back in when you started. The name is Magali Amelas Tiseira, who apparently is actually says hello, in case you didn't see that. I thought I would add that. These respondent, this questioner is curious to hear more about what actually addressed to Professor Iheka, the idea of the relationship between enrollment and perceived student interest, and whether these question of the relation between curricular and institutional space for something the African, going off, about colleagues, that is essentially whether the question of how many students are interested in African literature has really be of interest, and how that shapes the kind of thing that's taught. And I might quickly add that it's actually not limited to African literature. Well, I think there is a very interesting moment in his book, What is a Word? Postcolonialism as World Literature by Feng Chair, where actually was teaching a more broadly post-colonial thing from everywhere. And this was a graduate seminar. And it's interesting that students were also really graduate students in American University at UC Berkeley were essentially pushing back at this kind of diverse literature. So it's actually interesting that somebody at that level, the graduate level, was experiencing a similar kind of pushback from students. So I thought it would be interesting to address that. I think this is something that both the presenters and Kajetan can address in their responses. So we'll take that. And the second question is from Mercy Wambui, also another respondent, who says, I'm wondering how you view the role of structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s and the absence of support for educational system generally, and thereby disabling literature. I think that, in a sense, speaks to Godwin's intervention, though specifically drawing these on Kenya, but of course, it's a far more widespread kind of practice. And so let's take those. There are two more, but let's try and take those two and see how far we can go with them. Thank you.
Should I go, Bhakti? I mean,
sure. I think, yeah, and then Kajetan maybe.
Yeah.
After.
I'm in an institution where I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate to be able to teach not only one, but two classes focused on the African novel. So a cycle of canonical and then contemporary novels each semester. And I also, have these enrollment issues that Magali is talking about, that Kajetan is talking about. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about what some of the possible solutions to this could be. And my sense is that the awareness of African literature in North America has to happen at an earlier age. So, at the secondary level, not the tertiary level of education. And because our colleagues and high school teachers are not teaching African literature beyond Things Fall Apart, there's no consciousness of it. There's no interest stoked in it, right? Because there's no exposure to it. So it's seen so much as a kind of an oddity almost within literary curriculum. Like, that's a random thing I've never heard of. I'll sign up for that, right? Oh, there's African literature. Like, some of my students have that response, and I applaud them for following up with that by signing up for the class, right? But there's just and that goes, you know, that also goes for my peers, my colleagues who have read no African literature, right? And I, you know, and who evince a palpable lack of interest in learning about it as well, which I think is linked to this worry, this anxiety that we were talking about before. And I think it has to happen at an earlier age and become more a part of the understanding of what literature is on its own, right?
Yeah, I'll just add to that before Kajetan responds. I did my undergrad at Bard College, where Chinua Achebe used to teach. And the only people who took his classes were international students. It was never like Americans, you know, it was like this haven of international students, all students of color often, who would flock to his seminars, and then they would just read all kinds of, not just African literature, but also general post-colonial. So I agree very much with this particular idea. And one of the reasons not starting early to integrate African literature, or, you know, even like a foreign literature, but particularly African, in an earlier world of schooling, leads now to what we can say is like the Adichification of literature. You know, then it's like only becomes the only novel that anybody can relate to. It's like Americana, 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 you know. So yeah, so I think that could solve a lot of problems actually in the West.
Yeah, thanks for that. I like this, the notion of, you know, starting earlier, because it ties to the question of value, which is really what I was speaking to in my response. You know, why should they care about, why should they care about Africa? Because however I want to position this as this pure intellectual development, the question of value is at stake, you know, in these issues that we're dealing with. You know, what does Africa mean to them? So in my first year seminar, for example, in African literature, I get a decent enrollment, but I also realized that many of them are, you know, children of African descent, children of immigrants, you know, children of Africa, you know, like people like my children, you know, they're the ones, many of them are enrolled in this class. You know, we didn't have many of them at the University of Alabama, where I taught before. The enrollments, the numbers are also different, and I needed more, you know, for the class to make compared to what I need in the small seminar I'm teaching now. So for them, you know, for example, Africa means something, you know, Africa is important for them. So how do we make Africa mean something, you know, and, you know, beyond the economic model, which is what, you know, drives, for example, you know, the kind of interest that students have in other places. I'm not very sure, but I think it cuts across, you know, so many things. It's in literature. It's also in Alabama. I take students to South Africa, and, you know, the struggle to get 10, 15 students versus my colleagues taking students to England who are struggling with how to eliminate applications to take just 40 students, you know, to Oxford, you know. So the question of value, I think, you know, becomes, you know, is what I think, you know, so maybe a way to get to values to start earlier, to begin to teach them and not just tokenize the continent, you know, by teaching Adichie or just, you know, Achebe early on.
A few more questions coming in. So Godwin, do you want to respond quickly to the question about whether was there in fact structural adjustment program in Kenya, or I mean, was it a fact, or do you think, I mean, you didn't specify that, but the drift of your argument was that, yeah, there were social and political pressures on the universities. So do you want to say something quickly to that?
Yes. I mean, I agree with Mercy. Of course, the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and early 90s had a huge impact on the nature of the university. In fact, if I don't know how long Mercy's memory is, but that was the same it was the same period when university academic staff then began to agitate to have a union of their own so that they could negotiate for better terms of engagement with the government. And what happened at that time was that the government came down so hard on the university academics. People like Korwadar, Shadrach Guto, and others had now to actually flee to exile because at that time we still had detentions without trial. So what was actually supposed to be an economic reality, people dealing with the economic devastation of enforced adjustments, austerity, and so on, took on a political dimension. And many academics went to South Africa in the early 90s, to Zimbabwe, and so on. And of course, at that time, again, there was in Kenya the specter of paranoia, which people played around with the word paranoia to paramoia because of Moi's own paranoia, that he became obsessively, distasteful of the two departments, the Department of Literature at the University of Nairobi and the Department of Political Science. And of course, that disdain for the two departments trickled down in terms of the capacity, employment of staff, purchase of teaching and learning materials, and so on. And that had a huge impact on, first of all, the number of academics who could practice their trade in the Department of Literature, also the range and nature of research that graduate students could undertake, and so on. And so it went to levels where very few students could actually undertake graduate studies in literature to completion. And the few who did, of course, eventually were absorbed as academics or as actors in the NGO sector and so on. I guess the long and short of it is that we are partly where we are because of the consequences of the structural adjustment programs. At the personal level, at the departmental level, and even at the structural level, where university managers, for example, began by doing away with the disciplines that they consider to be of little value, to use Kajetan's word, of little value to the policies and priorities of the government at the time. And for some reason, the humanities, including literature and religious education, have tended to be viewed as of least value to the university system, which is weird, but that is the way it's perceived broadly. Yep.
Well, thank you. There are two more questions, and I think we can quickly address because though at the beginning we thought we had a lot of time, or we're as always getting towards the end of our blocked time. But two are from Addis KM and Sanjita Ray, who people known to the presenters, I imagine. Addis KM is asking what you think the data tells us about the genres and whether the novel taking the 67% implies something about the relative health of other genres, whether they are dying. So that's the question. And Sanjita Ray actually was wondering if anyone of you would like to elaborate on the ways in which, even under the rubric of Black diaspora, it actually becomes a way of privileging the Black Atlantic model. This transnationalization of Black literature does not end up centralizing the continent, but always granting African-American experience. Well, it's not necessarily that it's bad, but how does the model change? So if you want to respond to that.
Very quickly on Adiskea's question, yeah, it's 58% novels in the data we got, which absolutely, it's horrifying. But I think at least one of the reasons for that is the marketplace. I had done like a career fair where you recruit people to your majors. So everybody sets up their stalls and then you're like, come, become a lit major. And like the 2 or 3 conversations I had with parents who were super distressed that their children wanted to study writing. I was with a person who was much more experienced in doing this. And the person always gave the one response, which is like, you never know, your kid could be the next J.K. Rowling and could be a trillionaire, So it's always about this kind of marketplace concern. We have entered, African literature has entered now the phase of the $1 million deal with Yajesi Imbolo Mbue and I don't know about Adichie, but those two at least have signed $1 million deals. So it's a lucrative genre. It's a genre that reaches tons and tons of people. And as academics, we absolutely do not have the imperative to teach it, but we end up getting caught up. I mean, I end up reading all of them that come out. I want to be part of that conversation. I want to know what they're doing. So it's tough. It's a bad habit, but we have to change. Are the rest of the genres dying? I'm sure not, but they're certainly not making anybody even lead normal lives. I mean, poetry is in a pitiable state. Nobody gets paid. I do anthology after anthology. It doesn't sell. It's like it never sells, so it's about the market, I think.
I can begin to try to address Sangeeta's very, I think, complicated question. I think that the relationship between African studies and African American studies, not to mention also Caribbean studies, is a very uneven one, institution to institution. So if you look at some institutions, you see an African Studies department and an African American Studies department. At my institution, we have an African Studies minor and an African American Studies department, which is very new. It's reinstated. It existed before, it went away and became a program, it's now a major again. But in other institutions, you have Africana Studies departments where you have, which is the house for both African Studies, African American Studies, and Caribbean Studies, all in the same department. That seems the ideal arrangement to me, because the relations and connections between those three fields are then treated as worthy of consideration, both in terms of what students are receiving, but also at the level of collegial relations and exchanging of ideas. Mm-hmm. And Bhakti and I have talked about this in other places. I mean, one of the challenges of our contemporary moment is that there's a strong desire for diversification and a decolonizing of the university, but there's only a small allotted amount of space that is actually being given over to accomplishing that. And there is a great number of areas descending from area studies that want to take those spaces. And so it creates a contestation between these different groups where there should be more collaboration.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because this is such an important question, Sangeeta. I will just add that, in my own department, I'm seeing this a lot, and I've seen it in the past decade of teaching. The same American exceptionalism narrative always prevails. And I know that post-colonial studies jobs, post-colonial literature jobs were being displaced by Asian American studies, which became the hot thing in the last 15 years. And then suddenly, it's like, oh, is the Indian literature part of Asian studies? Who do we include, who do we not? But at the end of the day, it's centered the US. And then the same thing happens with now the coming of American Studies department, which everybody sees as a ticket to kind of diversity and decolonial thinking, because they will privilege at the end of the day African American studies. So it's very tough, but I think we're stuck within a nationalist model, and I don't know how to change it. At the end of the day, US had just, whether it's a faculty, whether it's the institutions, are just averse in a way to foreign lit. That's just the US, at the end of the day. I don't know how it works in the UK, if they're more open to kind of other countries, but the US is just a very navel-gazing situation. So that's my kind of one response.
Yeah, if you allow me to just pitch in at that point before we wind up, I think the question of whether the other genres of literature are dying or not depends really on where you're looking. From a Nairobi perspective, or from a Kenya perspective, I would say, for example, that there's a certain variation of poetry that is on a resurgence. I mean, if you talk about, for example, open mic forums in Nairobi poetry reading cafes and things like those. They're now happening at virtually every corner, sometimes organized by people who are barely out of their teens, college-going students, and so on. And what happens then is that we also have an upsurge of publishing houses that are publishing all sorts of poetry, and of course, falling prey to the market dynamics of poor distribution, poor publicity raising, and things like those. So poetry is very much alive. And I would say the same thing in the Kenyan situation about drama, especially we seem to have a penchant for social dramas in Kenya. You know, those very spontaneous public renditions of things that over and over again become they assume some textual formality, some textual rigidity, but which of course do not fall in the same category or do not say Death and the King's Horseman and things like those. So I think the reality is that as we were saying earlier on, when it comes to teaching these genres within the university curriculum setup, I think Lily's logic applies. There's very little room to wriggle around. But then when it comes to the existence of these genres as is, many of them are very much alive and well, even though they appear to operate under the shadow of prose and more specifically of the novel. Yep.
Okay, well, on which note, we're actually right on time. So thank you very much to the two presenters and to our respondents for their generous attention and giving up their time for this. It is a really very provocative topic, very topical, and it's going on. I think it's really interesting that we have all this broadening up happening. And so I want to thank you for agreeing to do this and for making time out to do to represent it in a new mode and also expand things for us. So thank you individually and collectively. Well, this is the end of our series for this semester, and in January again we'll start again. But for now, I'll wish you guys happy holidays or Christmas wherever you are, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
And thanks to Matt Brown.
Yes.
For running the event.
Exactly. Thank you, Matt. And we'll see you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.